It really is special to be together as the people of God because we do celebrate peace that we have because we are His. We have been, as the people of God, called out from the world and chosen by the Father, redeemed by the Son. We are being transformed by the Spirit, and we are journeying together to that great day when the reign of Christ will fill the earth. We've all had those moments in our lives where we've been able to experience that wonderful sense of, this is what I was made for. It may come when you're a parent and you look down at that motionless figure of a sweet daughter sleeping and her rhythmic breathing as she's deep into a sweet dream. And you watch her and think, oh, God made me a channel of life to this little one. And for a moment, you think, this is what I was made for. It may come at that moment when it's been a wonderful Christmas day, and you've been with your family, and now you're sitting down by yourself late at night at the fireplace. The hot cup of cocoa is in your hand, and in your ear is the replay of the sounds of children joyfully opening Christmas presents. The sound of laughter that occurred from everyone gathered around the dinner table. The memories that were shared over the great dessert that you ate together. And now you're sitting there by the fireplace thinking, how good it is to have this. This is what I was made for. We've all had these experiences. Yours might come sitting by the ocean side or standing atop a majestic mountain. But we all have some sense of what it's like to have those moments where you say, I'm but finite, but I have this connection with God who is infinite. I am so small, and yet somehow in this moment I have a recognition that my smallness is swallowed up in something much bigger. And it is so deeply satisfying. From the depth of our souls emerges this sense that says, wow, this is what I was made for. And while that sense might occur in these other different points of individual surprise, we really have seen it perhaps most profoundly in moments of worship. It's when we've been gathered as the people of God, and there have been those times when we've recognized that we have been confronted with an experience of God that is just overwhelming. It may bring us to tears. It may crush us in our spirits. It may cause us to shout. It may cause us to be stunned in silence. But whatever the reaction, there's a deep sense within us that says, I, the small person, am connected with the infinite, holy, majestic God. And this is what I've been made for. How we would like that to occur all the time in worship. But it doesn't. It just doesn't. And I'd suggest to you that despite our great desires, there are some reasons why that kind of satisfaction and God-connecting worship doesn't happen all the time. We live in a world that is so distracting of our attention to God. A world that is so fatiguing of and it takes like a thief our energy to worship God. And so with all the activities and responsibilities that we have from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday to Friday to Saturday, Sunday comes and, well, there's just not much left in the tank for that kind of worship. Our minds are filled with anxious thoughts through the week. We have bills to pay and employers to please and children to parent and classes to pass, and the list goes on of things that take away our our minds and our thoughts, and we find ourselves, even on a Sunday, a bit anxious about life. And so proper worship is difficult. We could add on top of all of that just our outright failures as sinful people. For certainly we come on a Sunday morning to worship our God, yet recognizing that we've failed through this week. There are things we have done that are only going to distance us from our God and from our brothers and sisters. There are things that we failed to do that only put up greater barriers between us and God. And so this desire to have God connecting, deeply satisfying, let's call it holy worship, go often unmet. What would God do for us to give us that kind of worship? What does God provide to help keep our worship proper? Is there anything that God gives to us that will actually help us in this desire to worship Him? This morning we want to answer that question, and we're going to answer it by looking at three provisions from God. Three things that God has given to His people that are really meant to help us as we worship Him with holy worship. And I think that what you're going to find is that these three provisions of God give us, I hope, a greater encouragement to worship well and a greater appreciation for how much God delights in having His children worship Him. We're going to look at a passage in the Old Testament where Israel was indeed having to grapple with this very same question, because Moses knew that these people were going to be entering the Promised Land. And they would be busy building cities, conquering foes, trying to figure out how to do life in a new place as a new generation of people. And so he recorded for them the very law of God that would help them with their worship, with three provisions for them. Now, some of you might look and go, wait, Old Testament? The Old Testament helps us in the New Testament era of worship? Indeed, it does. And well, we don't have priests like the Old Testament. We don't slaughter animals like they did in the Old Testament. And we don't have a temple or a tabernacle like they did in the Old Testament. But hold on with me, because what I'm going to suggest to you is that much of what we do and value in New Testament churches is rooted in Old Testament concepts and the way God set up worship for His people. So while some of the outward forms differ, a lot of the wonderful directives from God are very helpful for us. So the first of our three provisions from God. What did God provide for His people to help them worship properly? The first is this: God provides a promotion of holy worship. God provides a promotion for holy worship. In other words, He does things through people to help His worshipers do it well. And in the Old Testament, that was provided primarily through a group of people known as the Levites. God provided the Levites to promote holy worship amongst His people. Let me show you. We're in Numbers chapter 3. We'll read a few verses here where we get to introduce to this rather unusual class of people called the Levites. They're probably not an object of your attention too often, but what God does with them, it's so important. Numbers chapter 3 and verse 5. The Lord's giving directives to Moses, and this all occurred at Mount Sinai. Verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, "Bring the tribe of Levi and present them to Aaron the priest to assist him. They are to perform duties for him and for the whole community at the tent of meeting by doing the work of the tabernacle. They are to take care of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting, fulfilling the obligations of the Israelites by doing the work of the tabernacle. Give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are the Israelites who are to be given wholly, completely, exclusively, fully to him. We'll stop there for just a minute. God is calling out a group of people called the Levites, and he's using them to promote holy worship for Israel. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on that has a lot of background to it. So let's see if we can draw a picture of what all is happening here. The Lord commanded Moses to have this dedication program. What God is doing, he's saying to Moses, I've designated these people, and now I want you to bring them, and we're going to have a ceremony. We're going to have an installation ceremony. So sometimes, churches have an installation of a new pastor. A school might have an installation of a new president. This is an installation for a new kind of assistant to help the priests. Now he says, bring these folks forward and be presented to Aaron, who is the high priest. Aaron's the one who's going to have the most authority, the most responsibility in leading the people in worship. This command, as I said, occurred at Mount Sinai as Israel was preparing to leave for the Promised Land. Now, you've got to understand exactly where we are, otherwise it won't make any sense. Israel's headed over here. They got to make it to the Promised Land, but they're not there yet. Instead, they're a desert journey away. They're sitting here at Mount Sinai, been here for a year. They've already had the experience of having Moses raised up as their leader, a man who would, by God's grace and through the 10 plagues on Egypt, bring them out of Egypt, across the Red Sea, and bring them here to Sinai. And now they have a tremendous challenge. How do you get this whole group of people from where they are to where they need to be so that they can fight the battles of the Promised Land and still be people of worship? And so God says to Moses, I want you to bring these people under the encouragement of this tribe of Levi. You see, they're going to need help with their worship. They're going to walk across the desert. They've got men and women and children. They've got to find food. Yeah, manna is going to be provided, but how fast can you cook a meal without your camping equipment? And who has time and energy to worship? And where are you going to worship? There are all kinds of challenges in getting Israel from here to there. And so God sets aside this tribe or clan, this family, for special service. Now, they're called the Levites because they actually come from the third son of Leah. You'll remember back in the patriarchs, there was Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons, and one of his wives was Leah, and Leah gave birth to a son named Levi. So this tribe or clan would be all the people related, sons in particular, related to Levi. And as soon as you hear that here in chapter 3, if you've been reading since chapter 1, you say, well, not the Levites. They're a whole different kind of people. What we've learned earlier in the book is that the Levites, they've been different from the very beginning. They are not numbered. Now, most of us don't sit down and read for our devotions the book of Numbers because it starts off with a bunch of names and a bunch of numbers. How many people are in this family? How many people are in this family? How many people are in that family? And the reason is because God is preparing his people to go to war once they reach the Promised Land. And so he's numbering the men who are of fighting age and fighting ability. So there's this clan and this clan and that clan, and Levi is not numbered. What's the deal with that? Levites are not going to be fighting soldiers. Everyone else is being positioned for their inheritance in the land. When they get there, they're going to receive a piece of land for every family. Not the Levites. They're different. They don't get any land. Everyone else is going to be told how they will camp around the tabernacle where they meet God. And the Levites are given a very special, different place. From the very beginning of the book, we learn in chapters 1 and chapter 2, the Levites are set apart for something very different. But it's not a second-class role. It's helpful to envision what's happening here with the Levites and the rest of Israel. So imagine, well, we're the wrong shape, but just use your imagination that this auditorium is the tabernacle. Okay, so there's curtains and poles, and there's a Ark of the Covenant in here. We'll explain more about that later. But what I want to draw your attention, and what's explained earlier in the book of Numbers, is how different families or tribes are arranged around the camp. You don't get to just live wherever you want. You have to put your tent in the right place. So out east, that would be like the people in the gymnasium, right? If you're from the tribe of Judah or Issachar or Zebulun, you camp out there. You don't get too close to the tabernacle. And then if you are from the tribe of Dan or Asher or Naphtali, you're in the field out here to the north. You camp out that way. And then if you're from the tribe of Ephraim or Manasseh or Benjamin, you're out here, out back in the west, maybe in that vacant lot on the other side of the street. And if you're from Gad or Simeon or Reuben, you're in the south, maybe in the parking lot, maybe across the street, but you're over there. What about Levi? Levi is not given a place with the other tribes. All these tribes are going to be scattered around, or actually positioned around the tabernacle, and they'll know that the presence of God is right there in the middle of their camp. And when the cloud comes up and says, go forward, they'll all go forward together. And when the cloud settles, it will stop together. They're going to move in unison. What happened to the Levites? The Levites are positioned all the way around up close. They're just outside the wall. To the east, to the north, to the south, to the west. Why would that be? Oh, it's all related to their work. Because the Levites are going to have this special work to help all the people promote or be involved in holy worship of their God. Go back to the text and you'll see how the Lord uses them to safeguard worship, to promote worship, to ensure worship. Verse 7 in chapter 3 says that they are to perform duties for him, for Aaron, and for the whole community at the tent of meeting by doing the work of the tabernacle. Verse 8, they're to take care of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting, fulfilling the obligations. The idea here is that they care for the care of the furnishings. Probably primarily an idea of safeguarding, ensuring that everything is right, that everything the priest needs and everything the people need in order to worship well is taken care of. So they promote proper worship. I don't mean promote like advertising, not like Nike promotes tennis shoes. I'm talking about promote as in they make it go forward in a way that will really bring honor to God. They're set aside, their whole family, their whole tribe, to accomplish this, to help God's people connect with holy God in holy worship. And they will take care of all the details, very practical stuff that have to be done. Let's see if we can picture it. It says the Levites will take care of tabernacle furnishings. If you begin to look elsewhere in the Old Testament, begin to understand exactly what this might involve. The tabernacle was made of poles that had sockets and had to be stuck together, and it had curtains. If you've been here on a Good Friday, you've seen our curtains and poles. And you know what? Those things are heavy by the time you pick them up and pull them, and we can barely make them out to the other end of the building. The Levites, there was a special group of Levites who disassembled the poles and the sockets and the curtains. And the people who disassembled couldn't carry them. A different group was designated to then carry the poles. And a different group then to put them back together again, so that each day as they moved everything had to be handled so carefully. Why? Because it's a holy God. And these are his holy instruments set aside for holy worship. And it all has to be taken so seriously and carefully. Inside the tabernacle would be the candlestick and the altar and the wash basin. Different Levites would take care of them, making sure that they were cleaned, making sure they were handled, making sure they were packed up properly and transported to the next destination. Inside, of course, was the Ark of the Covenant, a gold-covered box that held the Ten Commandments and Aaron's rod that budded, and a mercy seat where sacrificial blood of the holiest kind was placed. And the Levites couldn't even touch that. That could only be handled by the priests themselves. And God is setting up a system where everything associated with his worship would remind the people he's a holy God. He's not like us. The real issue is not the amount of labor, although I'm sure it was a lot of labor. I cannot imagine disassembling the tabernacle, carrying it for a day's journey, and then reassembling it. That's a lot of work. But the real issue is the nature of the work more than the quantity, because of the way everything had to be handled. You see, no common Israelite could come and say, hey, let me help you with that, guys. I'll hold the curtains for you. Not permitted. A common Israelite could not come along and load the wash basin. A common Israelite could not carry along the poles to give the Levites a break. Only specified Levites could do that. And no common Israelite could help put it all back together. The Ark of the Covenant would go very carefully by the priests. Why? Because in all of this, God is saying repeatedly, with every step of the way, you don't approach me casually. God is not just another power genie in the middle of the camp. He is the object of fear, awe, reverence. And so God is promoting this holy worship. And again, I think there's a ton of practical stuff that the Levites have to do. If a sandstorm comes while they're putting up the tabernacle, they're going to have to work extra hard to hold the poles and get the curtains in place. Maybe it gets blown down, they have to prop it up. If a bull or a goat gets loose during worship, a Levite has to run and grab it and bring it in and hold it while it gets its throat slit. If a snake slithered under the curtain, it'd probably be the Levites who would have to find it and get it out. If somebody brings in their toddler and that toddler is disruptive, I imagine it's the Levites who take that child and take him to tabernacle church or children's tabernacle or whatever you would call it. Children's church, children's tabernacle, that's what you'd call it. You see, they safeguarded everything so that worship would go forward as it should, constantly reminding the Israelites that they must approach God on his terms and in his way. I think to appreciate this fully, we have to remember that the Israelites know something of this God. They've had some firsthand experience that would be terrifying. They watched this God bring 10 plagues on Egypt. The land covered with flies, the land covered with frogs, the people suffering, and then ultimately the plague of darkness and the plague of the death of the firstborn. They saw that. They saw God make a way through the Red Sea, and when they walked through and got safely to the other side, they saw him kill the Egyptians, the greatest army in the world. And they came to Sinai, and they saw this God shake the mountain with lightning and thunder and trumpet blasts, enough to make them all quiver in fear. And God is saying, you're going to leave Sinai, you're going to walk away from Egypt, but that God is going with you in the middle of your camp. Don't forget what he's like. A holy God, unlike any other God. And the Levites are going to be a living object lesson. Why? To promote holy worship. Well, we don't have Levites today, exactly. But we still have a God who has, I believe, provided a promotion, if you will, of holy worship for his people, for the church. And he does it through servants in the church. That God provides servants to promote holy worship in the church. Like in Israel, we're not talking about the high priest. We're talking about those who assist the high priest. Certainly we would all hold, and we should hold, that Jesus is our high priest, and none takes his role away from him. The Levites were not to steal the role of the high priest Aaron and his sons, but they came along and helped people worship through that priest to the holy God. So our desire is, like Israel, to worship this holy God, to bring a holy worship to him. We gather in his name. We want to do this, and we must begin with that recognition that he is high and lifted up. Our God is the same God, majestic, exalted, separated from us, not like us. And there is something about our God that is at the same time awesome and drawing us and awful to repel us. He is inviting and he is dangerous. And holy worship always lives in this tension. So we gather as people called out from the world, holy ourselves, to give adoration to this holy God, and we need help with that. Agreed? Because when we walk in and we gather, we have these great intentions, and yet our minds are afraid, and we have become anxious in our thoughts, and we've got other things going on in our lives, and we need help to worship as we would like to. And I think God provides that. God provides us elders who oversee everything that happens in our worship. The idea that our elders would help the community meet its desire to connect with the holy God. Some have prepared the Lord's Supper for us. Some will serve it. Another will officiate it. Some will receive our offerings so that we can worship well. Some have even cleaned our building and made it so that we can come. They've turned the lights on. Some will tend to our children in part so that we can focus on our holy God. Our musicians will lead us in singing, and our AV people will keep words on the screens and keep microphones live so that you can hear and participate. And all these things are done with a view toward connecting with the holy God. And our preachers proclaim the scripture not simply so that we can have our minds filled with ideas, but so that we might submit in worship to him. We don't have anyone named Levite, and yet God still promotes holy worship through these individuals. May I say a word to those of you who are involved in that kind of assistance to our great high priest? Please know your job is not just a job. You're not just doing something that needs to be done. You're not just filling a hole. Oh, take that opportunity to serve God's people as instruments helping us worship through our great high priest to the holy God. And some of you don't have a function in that regard right now. That's okay. And yet, how would you view the people who do those kinds of services? Not as employees, not as people who just, they had to fill in somewhere, but as people whom God has raised up to help us all worship. The church is not just some business. We're not just some machine with a bunch of gears that are figuring out how to work together under a CEO and a board of directors. We're the people of God who are being assisted in worship of the holy God. And God has given us people to promote that worship. That's the first provision. That's the long one. Next to our short, I promise. There's a second provision that God gives to us, and that is He gives us people the protection of holy worship. So the promotion of holy worship, now we have the protection of holy worship. And it's one verse, but a rather stirring verse in verse 10, where God provided the Levites to protect holy worship. Verse 10 in chapter 3 says this, "Appoint Aaron and his sons to serve as priests. Anyone else who approaches the sanctuary is to be," what's it say? "Put to death." So this ratchets up the seriousness quite a bit, doesn't it? That God is going to, I believe, actually use the Levites in this case, who are camped outside, just outside, to protect what goes on inside the tabernacle. The only people who can come in unfettered are the priests. Actually, they've been cleansed and they've had to go through all kinds of things in order to approach God and serve inside the tabernacle. Just outside will be the Levites. And if someone from another tribe decides, I'm going to the temple, I'm going to the tabernacle today, and they come in casually, they come in flippantly, or they come in subversively, it's the obligation of the Levites, most likely, to stop them. And if they do not stop, the sentence is death. Because God is going to protect his holy worship. It's a very serious thing. Why such an extreme protection? I mean, this seems kind of like over the top, right? Wow. I mean, we don't have any people at the door at the church doing this kind of thing. It seems that the Levites are charged with this kind of responsibility in order to stop the wrath of God that could impact the whole community. You see, if a person does in fact come in and defile the tabernacle, meaning make it ceremonially unclean, to abuse the holiness of God, the response of God is often seen not just on an individual, but on the whole community. And that progress toward the land is stopped. And sometimes there's fire from the Lord. In fact, in chapter 1, we have this indication of that in verse 53, and you can turn back and look at it some other time. The text says the Levites are to set up tents around the tabernacle of the covenant law so that, God says, my wrath will not fall on the Israelite community. The Levites have a very important task to protect holy worship. Does the church experience anything like this provision? I think yes. Now, we don't live in a theocracy, and therefore we do not execute people. That's not our calling, it's not our place. But be careful not to assume that because we don't use that mode of protection of God's holy worship, do not assume that means God doesn't want his holy worship protected with rigor. So I would suggest to you that through our elders and through processes like church discipline, God protects the holy worship of his church. The elders are charged with protecting the flock to make sure that false teaching does not occur, ready to correct if something goes awry. And I will tell you, you may never know But our elders here at Centerpoint do that. I'm so delighted to be able to say they listen carefully. And if something seems a little off in any teaching, they'll move to protect our worship. Our elders oversee the way worship is done. How are we doing as people come and sit and listen and learn and respond? And everything is under the careful protection of godly men who watch over us, especially true of the Lord's Supper, so that true worship can occur properly. And our elders have engaged in church discipline. Those points in time when a believer becomes so abusive of God's holiness that they're on a track to damage the community, and discipline will be practiced. And may I suggest that even as in the Old Testament, the Lord himself will take action as he deems fit to protect holy worship. We have these instances in the New Testament that are quite amazing, right? Acts chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira, who actually pretend to worship in their giving, but they're holding back and lying, and God strikes them dead. Paul says that in the place of Corinth, there are people who are abusing the worship of the Lord's Supper, and therefore there are many among you who are sick, and some have even died. We have a warning from Hebrews chapter 10 that reminds us, you have come to a different kind of Mount Sinai, one that isn't physical and shaking, but one that is even more terrifying because of our privilege to God, and our God remains as a consuming fire. I take it the New Testament is a call for us to remember that we must protect God's holy worship. And if we don't, he will. Wow. God provides for his holy worship. There's the promotion of his worship and the provision of his and the protection of his worship. Let me suggest a third way in which God provides for his people. And that is this: he provides a continuing remembrance of his redemption of his people. God provides a continuing remembrance, a stimulation to perk minds and hearts that says, remember, I redeemed you, you're mine. This is part of the role of the Levites, that God used the Levites in order to help Israel realize this. We're still back in chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. Notice what he says. The Lord also said to Moses, verse 11, I have taken the Levites from among the Israelites in place of, Keith's line, in place of the first male offspring of every Israelite woman. The Levites are mine, for all the firstborn are mine. Remember when I struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, I set apart for myself every firstborn in Israel, whether human or animal. They are mine. I am Yahweh. I am the Lord. What is this little paragraph about? God is saying to Moses and to Israel that he's provided the Israelites to be a continual remembrance of the redemption that God performed for his people. He positioned the Levites as firstborn, right? You caught that. They're going to be positioned as firstborn, fully devoted to the Lord. There's a couple reasons why this is so important. First of all, there's a whole theology or a concept of the firstborn that's been developed throughout the scriptures even to this point. The idea is perhaps that when a family has their firstborn son, that firstborn son is to go back to the Lord out of a recognition that he's the one who provided fertility. He's the one that provided life. So this firstborn son must be returned to the Lord. It could also well be that the firstborn is the symbolic of the whole. So to give the firstborn or the first fruits is a symbolic way of saying all of my family really belongs to the Lord and fully devoted to him. But God makes it explicit here, the reason why he does it. He says, I'm particularly wanting the Israelites to remember that day back in Egypt when the plague on the firstborn came. And in every Egyptian family, the firstborn was killed. And even with their animals, the firstborn was killed. Why? Because Israel is my firstborn son. And God was extracting Israel from that situation. But for Israel, he protected them with redemption, a redemption price of a lamb and the blood of the lamb. And now what he says to them is that the Levites are kind of taking the place as the substitute for that lamb. The lamb is dead and gone. The blood is dried up. But now the Levites, they are in the place of that firstborn. Wow. So every time that a worshiper in Israel sees a Levite, you know what they're going to do? That's our firstborn. Wholly devoted to God, serving God. That's us. That's my family. That's who we are. So the Levite reminded people constantly, not with his mouth, but with his mere existence, we've been redeemed. The firstborn for the whole family belongs to him. Holy worship requires this kind of remembrance. And so in the New Testament for us, we don't have Levites who do that for us. But God has indeed given us the Lord's Supper, which serves as this continual reminder, right? You've been redeemed at the cost of a firstborn son. Been redeemed by blood to rescue you from the clutches of an evil world and sin. In the Lord's Supper, we see ourselves as people completely devoted to God, like a Levite, called out to give ourselves fully in service to him. And each week the Lord's Supper provides that kind of stimulation to our memories so we worship well. God wants his people to be involved in holy worship, recognizing who he is and what he's done for them. My friends, gathering for worship is not a small task. It's not a simple little thing. It's a wonderful privilege. And we come before the holy, infinite God as fragile, frail, sinful, forgiven people. And God says, draw near, pay honor, but do it his way, carefully, through his priest, the Lord Jesus. We don't come for entertainment, we don't come for therapy, we don't come for self-fulfillment. You can go to churches that do that. We come for worship. Let's be a church that, like God himself, promotes holy worship, protects holy worship, and indeed remembers our redemption. And I think we'll walk away most days going, this is what I was made for. And so, our Father, we acknowledge that you have called us to this great task of worshiping you. We're staggered. We know that left to ourselves, our worship will be so inadequate. We thank you that you have given to us here at Centerpoint people, many people who desire to see worship done well. And so I pray that we will respond as we should, with good preparation and great attitudes and people who want to see holy worship proceed. So give us this vision and this zeal, I pray, for Jesus' sake. Amen.